My conversation today is with author and astrologer John Michael Greer. It was an absolute pleasure to welcome John back to the show to discuss his most recent book, The Astrology of Nations. Having translated and annotated the Picatrix, an extremely influential Arabic treatise on astrological magic from the Middle Ages with Christopher Warnock, he has once again rendered us what will become another astrological classic, this time on the study and practice of mundane astrology, as the book's name implies. We sat down today to talk about the practice of mundane astrology, astrological magic, some astrological forecasts for the future, and much more. I'm Ike Baker, and this is the Arcanum Podcast. The great JMG, John Michael Greer, joining me once again on the Arcanum Podcast. Thank you so much for being here with me, my friend. It's always an honor.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. I always enjoy it.
So, how have you been, man? I want to just friendly little catch up.
Just a little catch up. It's been up and down. Just in my personal life has been a little rough. My wife passed away about a year ago, and after a long illness, but I've been kind of picking up from there, and I have more free time now, so I've been doing a lot of esoteric practice, a lot of work, a lot of research in astrology, translating some Latin stuff from John D. Speaking of astrologers, and just you deal.
Yeah,
it sucks, but you deal.
Yeah. I was very saddened to hear that. I want to just take a minute and dedicate this episode to the late Sarah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
She was always extremely kind to me in the interactions we had. So, but I'm happy to see you out there because I've seen you traveling for some Masonic conferences. You've met up with my good friend Jamie Lamb and all that stuff at Esotericon, and so real happy that you're still out there and giving us your light.
Mm-hmm. Well, it would not have benefited me or anybody else for me just to kind of slump into not doing anything. So I figure I might as well get out there and start doing stuff again. It's been.
We thank you for it. I want to talk about today specifically astrology and your latest book, which is coming out. Which will probably be out by the time this airs in a week or two, The Astrology of Nations. So I really loved reading this. It was a real pleasure that Red Feather sent it over to me, and I got to kind of do a review and give them a blurb for it. It's this mundane astrology, admittedly, not as it's sort of glossed over. It's not as popular as things like natal, horary, and you address that, and you gave so much context and education in the first part of the book. It was concise yet complete. I'm wondering what inspired you to take on a book on mundane astrology.
Well, okay, to start with, I almost always, due to some details of my natal chart, I almost always go into things from an unusual direction. Everyone else starts with natal astrology. Almost everybody else. They start by taking up the study of birth charts, okay? And which is fine, but I didn't get into astrology that way. I got into astrology by way of my magical practices because I needed to know, first of all, how to calculate the timing of certain kinds of rituals that need to be done under the right astrological conditions. So electional astrology, as that's called, was my first introduction to astrology. And then I got into horary astrology, which is astrological divination, because that was one of the things that was taught in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn back in the day. And I was in a kind of, typically obsessive fashion, I was sort of plunging into the Golden Dawn, trying to do it whole hog and get the same kind of education somebody would have gotten if they were a member of Isis Urania Temple in, say, 1890. So I came into it that way, and then I ran across a book on mundane astrology. I went, this is interesting. Let's see how it works. And I found out two things very quickly. The first was that most, as you've noticed, most people in the astrological scene know nothing about it. And the second thing I found out is that if you do it in the traditional manner, it works extremely well. You can get some amount of foreknowledge of political trends before they happen. So I worked with that, and I posted some mundane charts on my blog. And it just kind of spun out from there. I ended up setting up a Patreon and a Subscribestar account where I could post regular mundane astrology posts, and those became extremely popular. And so I said, aha, there is a book in this. Because there are some books, there are some decent books on mundane astrology available, but the most recent one I know of dates from the late 19th century, the most decent one of any quality. And there's some updating that needs to happen. As most of those books are also very much looking back toward the Renaissance traditions, and so they assume that you have, for example, a king, which most of us don't these days. And they assume they have all kinds of assumptions as to social mores and what economic possibilities and so on. And so I did a lot of updating, a lot of working through on the basis of, okay, let's see how this works in practice. Which planet seems to affect, for example, non-governmental organizations? Which houses rule the internet? And through that experience and practice, I was able to generate a fairly effective way of doing that, and so I published it as a book.
That's outstanding. I absolutely love the fact that you, right at the outset, you openly state, like, you know, I'm not quoting verbatim here, but let's not kid ourselves. Nobody understands the mechanisms of astrology. It just
Oh
kind of
yeah,
works.
yeah, exactly. No, it's the thing is, it would be lovely if the American Federation of Astrologers could get a $20 billion grant to engage in a 20-year research project with the aid of major observatories and radio astronomers to try to figure out why astrology works. It'd be lovely. I don't expect that to happen anytime in this millennium. So, it'd be. I'm not going to worry about it. We're in the same position with astrology that Isaac Newton was in dealing with gravity. He could tell you exactly how gravity worked. He had the math down. He could explain it. He could explain how it functioned. When it came to, well, why does it happen? What makes this thing work? He famously said, I offer no hypotheses. I don't know, and I don't know that anyone knows. All I know is this is what happens. These are the rules that govern it. That's the position we're in with astrology right now. We know what happens. We know how A leads to B. We don't know the force behind it. And it may take many centuries and an intellectual revolution on the order of the one that Einstein carried out. When he pointed out that the physics actually only works if space is curved, and if it curves around matter. Once he did that, it was possible to say, okay, this is what gravity is. Gravity is the curvature of space. But that was that was unthinkable in Newton's time. And in the same way, I think whatever intellectual revolution in the future might reveal to us how astrology works will probably be unthinkable in terms of 21st century thought.
Yeah. And I think that your position, particularly as someone who is at the forefront of teaching and explaining these things and has been for decades now, like I mentioned to you a little earlier, I've been reading your stuff for at least 15 years, but I think that your position is very intellectually honest, and it's quite refreshing. I think that the best magicians, I've seen it as a typically magical trait. Like traits among magicians they're very pragmatic. If it works, I use it.
Does it work? We can theorize until the cows come home as to why it works. The question is, does it work? Yeah.
Right. And so I want to bring up something subject of a little controversy in the last couple of years, but I found your again the reasoning behind why you actually don't prefer to use whole sign house systems because of this the idea of interception. Can you
Hmm.
I'm sure you're aware that there's been this whole thing lately with particularly Hellenistic forms of
Hmm.
astrology kind of adopting the whole sign house, and among the astrological community, plenty of controversy there. Can you explain the idea of interception and maybe a little bit of your reasoning on why you don't use whole
Okay.
sign houses? I think that'd be really
Okay.
good for people to hear.
Very, very straightforward. Basically, just for any of the readers, any of our listeners rather, who don't know enough about astrology, have any idea what we're talking about here. Um, you've all heard of the signs of the zodiac. You all know about the planets. There are also a set of 12 houses. The sky is divided into 12 houses, which are determined by the place that you're standing on the Earth at the moment for which the chart is cast. And so, for example, the 10th house starts from directly above you and goes, a certain number of degrees toward the eastern horizon. And the first house is, and so on and so forth. Each of that, they're simply sort of abstract divisions of the sky. And it's been found through the last 5,000 years of experience that when a planet is in one of these houses, or when it rules the cusp, that planet influences whatever it is that house rules. For example, in mundane astrology, the 10th house tends to rule government, in particular the executive branch. And so, if depending on what planet is in the 10th house, if there is one, or what planet rules the sign in which the cusp of the 10th house is located, that will tell you a lot about what's going to happen in a mundane chart in terms of the executive branch, in a natal chart in terms of your career, and those, your superiors, those things toward which you strive upwards. Okay, so those are houses. Now, there has been bickering about how to divide the sky into these houses for, I think pretty much since the house system was invented in late Roman times. Domification was the term back in the Renaissance, and there was squabbling about it. There have always been various systems of domification. The whole sign system is a late Hellenistic development, and where you simply assign each house, you treat the entire sign in which the house cusp falls as that house. The problem with that is purely a pragmatic one. I have found in my own experience that if you use a sign that permits interception, an intercepted sign is a sign that does not have a house cusp in it. If you use a system that allows for interception, that will tell you things which you will not get from a whole sign system. If you find a planet in an intercepted sign, for example, that planet is going to be, and those things affected by it will be much more restricted, much more limited. They will, in fact, be sort of cut off, as the interception suggests. And that planet won't have as much influence in that house as it would if it were not intercepted. So my response is a purely pragmatic one. What system permits me to make the most accurate predictions? And that requires me, of course, to look at my predictions and then look at what actually happens. If the whole sign system produced more accurate predictions, I'd be going, hey, great, I'll use that. It doesn't. It routinely misses important points where the Placidus system of domification, which I use, gives me that information that I need. It allows also sometimes you end up with two cusps in the same sign. And that also tells you something. That tells you that certain things may be linked together over the period ruled by that chart. And you wouldn't get that information from a whole sign system. So it is very pragmatic in nature. It's not a matter of theory. It's not a matter of, well, this is traditional. It's bugger tradition. Tradition doesn't matter. I mean, I wonder how many people who are saying, well, we have to do the old traditional thing, how many of them would want to use a TRS-80 computer nowadays?
Right, exactly.
Hey, that's a tradition. That's much older and more traditional than the latest computers, right?
Yeah. And
Or a slide rule. Or
yeah.
how many of them would love to calculate their horoscopes with tables of logarithms? That's how I originally learned how to do it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, same thing here. Actually, believe it or not, especially through the Golden Dawn system, where you're using the
Oh
table
yeah.
of houses, it's crazy. Yeah, and I appreciate that perspective quite a bit because I've managed to not get caught up in this sort of new thing that's happening because really I see it in the more academic and academic influenced circles of occultism and practical magic, and this idea that older is better. And I think that your analogies are perfect. So I would agree with you on that. You know, and your reasoning really helped me because I was using whole sign houses, and I admit that my interpretative yield would oftentimes be wanting, and so I'd switch to something like porphyry just to see what I get. But it's still a similar kind of idea. So I'm glad that you got to say that. I hope the listeners really let that sink in.
Well, I do want to say, just for Hellenistic astrology has introduced, or reintroduced, I should say, a lot of very useful techniques. It has a lot of strengths. I'm not trying to say that it's outmoded, we ought to ignore it, this kind of stuff. It has a lot to teach. But my point of view, which is of course not everyone's point of view, it's simply the point of view that I work from as a working astrologer, as somebody who who needs to produce accurate predictions. I take the things that work. I take the things that I find produce accurate results in practice. And if you want to do something else, go right ahead. I'm not trying to say everyone ought to rush out and get rid of their whole sign things and do everything using Placidus or Regiomontanus or Cook or something like one of the other domification systems. It's just because I am in the business of providing accurate predictions. I need to focus on those things that provide me with those predictions, irrespective of whether they fit, some notion of tradition, some notion of theory, anything like that.
One of the things that you also address in the first part of the book, I really love the layout too, how you give the theory. I don't think, to be honest with you, and I'm not just kissing your ass here, I'm serious. I don't think I've ever seen a more concise yet complete breakdown of the basics of astrology.
Oh, okay.
Ever.
Good heavens. Okay, I'm sure that I have, although I'd have to go looking in a bookshelf in another room to answer that. I've seen some things like that. Although now mostly it's in books on things other than natal charts.
Right.
Many of there are books on horary astrology, for example, that do the same kind of run through of, okay, here are the planets and this is what they mean. Here are the signs and this is what they mean. Here are the houses and this is what they mean. Here are the aspects and here's what they mean.
And you're talking about face, term, peregrine. I mean, it's jam-packed of excellent material.
Yeah, and the thing is, I had to do that because all of those things make a difference when you're looking at a mundane chart. You cannot afford to ignore minor dignities. You cannot afford to avoid, if a planet is peregrine, you need to know that. Peregrine, by the way, for our non-astrologically up-to-date readers, is a planet that has no dignity at all. It has no particular strength in a given sign or subsection of a sign. So when a planet is peregrine, its energies are very weak in a mundane chart. You need to know that. So everything that I put in there is there because I found through some years of experience, you have to know about it in order to get an accurate chart.
And one of the things that you lay out is the mistake of the inexperienced using like the natal astrology background that they have for mundane work. Can you give us a little synopsis of how those two techniques differ in the most meaningful way?
Okay. Basically, for natal astrology, it is very important to pay attention to all the minor details. You have to pay attention to the smallest aspects. Or the least important aspects. You have to pay attention. It's important to pay attention to dwarf planets. There's been some excellent work with asteroids. Each of these helps fill out if you're trying to understand a personality. If you're trying to kind of illuminate a personality, these little things actually really do count. In mundane charts and in predictive astrology generally, if you focus on the little things, you will tend to make inaccurate predictions because it's the big things that actually shape events. If you've got, Mars square Saturn strongly placed, that's going to bring about, all kinds of unpleasant events, or it's going to signal the coming of unpleasant events. And it doesn't matter if you have 14 minor things that are saying, oh no, things are going to be fine. Things will not be fine. And so it's very important to keep the different levels of information give them their proper weight, and to note, for example, especially what's the sun doing, what's the moon doing, what are each of the houses and their rulers doing. If you know that, you know most of what's going on. Anything else is as likely as not going to be a distraction. It will be swamped by the influence of these major factors. So that's a very important difference between mundane astrology and natal astrology. Of course, the other problem is that natal astrologers, since they've been trained to look for birth charts, they focus on birth charts or the equivalent. They're very much they look for the birth charts of leading politicians. That could be useful, but it can have some drawbacks. I recall some years ago, somebody in an astrology magazine was trying to explain, okay, this is what's going to happen to the United States in the next over the next year, and we're going to use Barack Obama's birth chart. He was president at the time. Okay, we're going to use Barack Obama's birth chart as a guide to this. And I was going, hold it, what? To use the example I put in my book, 1865 was a really bad year for Abraham Lincoln, but it was a really good year for the United States of America. You can't use the president's birth chart as a guide to the destiny of the nation. It just tells you how he's going to do.
Right.
And so, in fact, the predictions that were made in this article were quite wrong. And so that's the kind of thing you see. Or you see people fixating on foundation charts for nations. Those can be useful, but they're not the be-all and end-all. The core, the bread and butter of the mundane astrologer is ingress charts, basically charts for the moment at which the sun enters each of the 4 seasons of the year. So we have your Aries ingress, you have your Cancer ingress, you have your Libra ingress, and your Capricorn ingress. And at that moment, for the place is the capital of the country, the moment of that gives you the time and date. That gives you a snapshot of events over the next 3 months. Sometimes longer than that, depending on what kind of sign rises. But we don't have to get into those details quite here. That was the basis for thousands of years. That was how people found. That's how you can judge the astrological weather. Also, eclipses. Eclipses will always tell you what kind of problems are on their way. Eclipses are always malefic; they're always negative. But there's always something bad happening. It's one of the natures. That's the part of the nature of history. And so your eclipse tells you what to look for, what to watch out for, how long it will last, and how it's going to affect the country you're dealing with. And finally, outer planet conjunctions. That's something that especially Persian and then later Arab astrologers got deeply into. The conjunctions of, back in the day, it was mostly Jupiter and Saturn. Now, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, any combination of those will tell you quite a bit about historical periods. When Jupiter and Saturn were conjunct in December 21st, 2020, for example, that ushered in a new period of history, and things started to change. I think many of us noticed that. So those 3 classes, those are the primary classes of charts that I work with as a mundane astrologer, and they provide a very different view, but generally speaking, a much more useful view than trying to focus too intently on foundation charts or the natal charts of politicians.
I'm wondering actually your thoughts on. Well, first, the first thing that comes to mind, you mentioned the foundation charts of nations, and you do give one that the rest of the book is charts, which is fantastic, and you give a really, really, I want to say, thorough analysis of each one of the examples. You have your case studies, and then you have your actual predictions, which is fantastic. And you've got that foundation chart, and things have been crazy for a long time, but things have sped up in the last year, in the last 6 years. And I'm not trying to be alarmist or anything like that, but what really kind of I found eerie was you addressing right out of the gate Saturn in the 10th house and talking about
Saturn in the 10th house. That's the foundation chart of the United States has been the subject of an enormous amount of obfuscation and, I think, deliberate camouflage, dating all the way back to within a short time of the foundation of the country. If you go through the literature on this, you'll find the weirdest charts being brought up. People insisting that the foundation chart was 2 a.m. on July 4th, 1776, which is just crackers. Okay, the Declaration of Independence was not signed at 2 in the morning. Everybody was sound asleep. Many of them having drunk themselves to sleep. Our founding fathers were a hard drinking lot, but no, they were. So, but the problem is that the date that seems to be most probable, the date and time, which is around 5:12 p.m., 5:10, 5:12, somewhere around there, on July 4th, Saturn is in the 10th. And that is one of the biggest, loudest warning signs in any form of astrology. In natal astrology, when you have Saturn in the 10th, you know that the person in question is going to suffer a sudden fall from a very high position. John F. Kennedy had that placement. So did Adolf Hitler. So did Wilhelm II of Germany, the last Kaiser. It's the classic position for somebody who rises to great fame or power within whatever sphere they, and then falls from it completely, either through sudden death or being deposed as the Kaiser was. So one of the implications of that is that when the United States finally ends, as every nation has a lifespan, every nation has a beginning and it has an end.
Right.
And so there will come a time where there will not be a United States of America anymore. And whether that happens by through civil war, through a dissolution by way of a constitutional convention, or simply whether it's replaced by a new form of government, and that will happen with Saturn in the 10th. That will happen very suddenly at a time when the United States is still relatively powerful. It won't be one of these nations like Spain, let's say, which ruled the world in 1500. And is now a very small and relatively powerless nation, one little part of the European Union, which is not really that powerful in the world. It's not that the United States is not going to trickle away like that. Its end will be sudden. What kind of end is it going to be? That's really hard to say, but that's one of the things that predicts, and I think that's one of the reasons so much squid ink has been squirted around that subject over the years.
Yeah, I had never looked at the foundation chart of the country until I saw this, and I was really glad it was one of the first things that you pointed out. My question to you, this is another sort of subject of debate among the broader astrological community. I admit that it's nuanced for sure, but I want to get your take on it, and I want people to hear your take on it. Some astrologers, particularly ones that are very, very visible, I'm not going to name any names, have an extremely deterministic view of astrology. I'm wondering, are you more of a complete determinist when you look at this stuff, or
no.
do you account for free will?
My experience has been that deterministic analyses of astrology again produce bad predictions. There is always wiggle room, and in particular in mundane charts, human nature is very very unpredictable, and you never know which way the frog's going to hop. My experience is that astrology predicts trends. It predicts likelihoods.
Right.
In a mundane chart, you can often get very, very accurate, but in a lot of ways, a lot of cases, you can't actually tell exactly what's going to happen. You can tell what kind of thing is going to happen. There's going to be, for example, let's say a resurgence in religion. There's something going on in the 9th house, but that doesn't tell you which specific churches people are going to flock to. You may be able to tell that there's a really large there's a lot of pressure toward violence, but is that going to show itself as a war overseas? Is it going to show itself as civil unrest and war? Again, that's very difficult to tell. It can be, depending on there are specific indications that say, oh, that's a foreign war. Look at what's in the 7th house. But if you don't get that, if you don't get that specific kind of thing, sometimes, when I interpreted the inauguration chart for Joe Biden, for example, a little more than 4 years ago, it really looked as though, to me, there was a major risk of civil war. But in fact, what it was predicting, I went back into retrospective late last month, explaining, going through it and pointing out what I got right, what I got wrong, and the things that I had missed, a couple of things that made it clear that no, what was going to happen was the Ukraine war and then the various war in the Middle East. and that the United States was going to be involved in those, not directly, but in a way that was going to damage its prestige internationally, and cause various other problems. So astrology gives us trends. It gives us probabilities. It gives us directions in which things are moving. I don't find a deterministic approach to produce good results. I don't find that it produces accurate predictions. And again, that's what I do. That's what I'm in the business for.
Yeah, and especially coming from a magical background.
Oh yeah.
Particularly the milieu within the Golden Dawn, which is explicitly theurgic. The whole purpose of theurgy is to get above high harmony, right? Is to get above fate in as much as you can. So I think magicians are going to have a little bit more of a liberal attitude with that.
Well, and also if you've done successful magic, you can you focus on the end result. You focus on your goal, not on the means to get there, because the means could be anything under the sun.
Right.
You focus on, let's say, getting a better job, and the way you get the better job may be the most absurd cascade of coincidences that has ever happened, or it may be as simple as just happening to glance and seeing an ad in the paper, or I suppose nobody uses the paper anymore, seeing an ad online and emailing them and finding out that you're perfect for the job. You can't predict the means. You can focus your energy on the ends. And so I know a lot of practicing magicians, a lot of people who know their way around practical magic. They get very used to the fact that there's a lot that you can't predict.
One of the more interesting things, too, I truly do believe that this particular book, like for somebody steeped as you are in astrology, and probably, I'm guessing here, possessing the the private library of books that you have, it might
I got a pretty good collection.
I can imagine, but that aside, right? For I would say the overwhelming majority of people, particularly in the last couple of years since astrology's gotten very popular, there are topics in this book that I haven't seen covered anywhere. And one of them that was the most fascinating are the grand mutations. And we actually had one. You talk about the one in 1425, one in 1663, and then you save the one that just recently happened for part 3 of the book, the grand mutation of 2020 that took place on December 21st of that year. Can you tell the audience and myself a little bit about mutations and what these things signify to you?
Yeah. This is an important part. I was talking earlier about the outer planet conjunctions. The cycle of Jupiter and Saturn conjunctions is extremely important in traditional astrology. That was the one that I mentioned the Persian and Arab astrologers had gotten deeply into it and had worked out entire theories of history on the basis of it. And so basically, if you track the conjunctions of Saturn and Jupiter, those happen about every 20 years. And due to the orbital speeds of the two planets, it so happens they usually take place in signs of the zodiac that have they're ruled by the same element. So they'll be in fire signs. They'll happen in 3 fire signs over and over again for a long period, for a period of getting on for 200 years. And that's called, by the way, a grand trigon, which sounds like something out of a tacky science fiction novel, but astrologers got there first. Okay. So, but when you're in a given trigon, okay, that represents one period of history, and again, it's between 150 and 200 years, and then because as the trigon slowly drifts and eventually clunk, it passes into a new element, and that's what we just saw. We had in 2020, we had the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius, at the beginning of Aquarius. So it had actually shifted from the Earth signs into the air signs. And now the Earth sign period, which came about in the early 1840s, as I recall, and that was a very strange chart. I discuss it in there, and I also give a 19th century analysis where they predicted what was going to happen and actually got some things astonishingly right, as well as there were some mistakes. But that was a period in which, notably, there was a real focus on the moon dominated the chart. The moon dominated like 3/4 of the heavens, and all the other planets were piled up next to it. The moon and the sun were in opposition. It was in some ways a very messy chart, but it very well predicted the era of well, it's hard to use the word democracy without everybody getting dewy-eyed about it, because everyone has this idea that democracy is an ideal. What we're talking about is government by elected officials who may or may not be bribed and may or may not have bought their positions, but just governments by elected officials became almost universal around the world, where in 1820 and 1840, before this happened, this was not the case. That's the dominance of the moon, which represents the politically active classes, as opposed to the sun, which represents a monarchy, or the head of any head of state. So we had this very unusual historical period, also a period when the arts were frankly in eclipse. Venus was in dreadful condition, and so we had the rise of modern art. Heaven help us. And generally, the arts generally made a huge effort to be as offensive and unpleasant to people as possible. Mm-hmm. You could not build an artistic career unless your art, whether it was painting, whether it was sculpture, whether it was theater, it had to offend and annoy people, or you literally couldn't get. All the critics would go, you're just pandering to popular taste. Before then, nobody thought of that. Before then, the idea was you do art and you make it beautiful. Gosh, what a concept. Well, on the one hand, the moon and the sun are no longer in that position. As we move past this thing in 2020, we're going to see a lot fewer elected governments over the next 199 years. We're going to see more monarchies. We're going to see more open oligarchies, as opposed to the covert oligarchy that democratic governments usually become. We are going to see much less in the way of ugly art, because that bad condition of Venus is no longer in place. Interestingly, Uranus, the planet of technology, was very well dignified in that earlier. He is not well dignified in the 2020 chart. So we are going to see, on the one, he is retrograde among other things, and in his fall, and so we are going to see technologically caused disasters become rather common, and we are going to see, because he's retrograde, some of the more advanced technologies of our time will very probably be abandoned, because they'll turn out to be more expensive than they're worth, or they will turn out to have problems, or simply we won't be able to maintain them, given some of the economic problems that are also predicted. So it's going to be a very different age. And that's going to go on for, as I said, 199 years. As I recall, it's Halloween of 2219 is when we go into the next one, when it cycles over from air into water. And then yet another age of the world begins with its own potentials and possibilities.
Wow. Very powerful stuff, man.
One of the things I really want to say here, and it's a point that I make in the book, is that yes, I know this isn't what everyone wants. This isn't what everyone's the sort of Tomorrowland future that we've all been fed by the mass media.
Yeah.
Oh, and it's also not the apocalyptic everyone dies next Thursday future that we've also all been fed by the mass media. And so that's one of the things that I know makes people kind of back away a little bit from mundane astrology, because it doesn't cater to our mental stereotypes. But if I may touch on a point that may be somewhat sore right now, it is not a good idea to judge your astrology on what you want to, especially in mundane astrology, on what you want to happen. I think we all remember how many people were loudly asserted until a month before last that Kamala Harris would certainly win the election. Just as in 2016, vast armies of astrologers were out there insisting that, of course, Hillary Clinton was going to sweep the election and usher in a new golden age, or what have you. Don't get high in your own supply is the best best advice I can give here. If you're in the business of prediction, you need to be aware that the stars and history itself are not listening to you. You need to listen to them. They're not going to do what you tell them. You need to find out what they're telling you. That can be very difficult for a lot of people. I understand that. But if you're in the business of making predictions, you got to get used to it.
Yeah. Sage advice, really. That needs to be out there and understood. And it also kind of dovetails with another point that you make in the book is, perhaps for the reason, perhaps somewhat behind the reasoning of
Mm-hmm.
this interest in astrology is that we live in an egotistical, even egomaniacal age where people just love to hear
Yes.
about themselves. So,
Well, that I think is why there's been such a focus on natal astrology, and on specifically on the kinds of natal astrology that are focused on personality. Yeah, everyone wants to hear about themselves. Everyone wants, people are willing to pay a natal astrologer to sit there and talk about them for an hour or two at a time. I see a lot less interest in the predictive aspects
right.
of natal astrology. That's something that I've been working on recently, trying to get fairly good at using my transits, and also especially using progress charts to predict how things are going to go for me in year by year. I find it quite accurate, but of course, accurate also means that it brings the bad news. And I think that's one of the reasons people don't want to hear about it, because life does bring us sorrow. It does bring us grief and trouble, and as well as joy and hope and possibility. And if you're going to do astrological prediction on a natal level, on any other level, you need to deal with that and not pretend that it's not the case.
Right. And, we mentioned a little bit about late Hellenistic astrology before.
Mm-hmm.
And, as many other popular astrologers, or at least a few of them, have pointed out, the whole idea back then, they were a little bit more deterministic about it,
Mm-hmm.
some of them. And the whole idea behind getting a chart read or doing a chart was so that you could, in this very stoic ethos, accept it before it happened and not let it crush you. So I find value in that as well.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Well, I've actually seen a certain amount of renewed interest in Stoicism generally recently. I think it's an excellent sign, because the Stoics, if you have to deal with difficult times, and we all do at some point in our lives, we're always going to go through bad times. Stoicism is the best thing I've known to deal with it.
Right.
I mean, now, it's not comfortable. It's not comforting. It's a cold, wet towel across the face, and an old Greek philosopher looking at you and saying, "So why are you whining?" But that has huge advantages.
I love my people.
Oh yeah. Well, Epictetus in particular has gotten me through most of the really hard times in my life. I go back to the Enchiridion and just read that, and it's a wonderful reminder that life is what it is, and all you can do is pick yourself up and keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. That said, all this kind of predictive stuff, have you dialed in to anything going on in this year, 2025? I know there's so many things going on.
Yeah.
Outer
heavens,
planets
yes.
are ingressing. Tell me a little bit about what you found, if you don't mind.
Okay. So far, let's see. I haven't yet done the spring ingress charts. That's next on the agenda. I did the winter ingress charts for the United States and Great Britain, which are the two countries I track. Those indicate in the case of the United States, which I've been studying recently due to some of the recent events going on, that predicted a period of wrenching change. There's a T-square active in it that is releasing very powerfully in the direction of institutions. We're going to see a lot of sudden wrenching changes, as of course are now underway, and but those aren't going to affect most Americans that dramatically, whether they're booing or cheering or what have you. It's something on the media screen rather than something that they're actually having to deal with up front and in person. One thing that I also did, the comet that's currently cycling through the skies, Comet Atlas. I did, because studying comets used to be an important part of mundane astrology. I have been digging around looking for sources, and finally found some decent Renaissance era material, and was able to take from the details of the planet or of the comet's color, of where it appeared, and this kind of stuff, this prediction that it would mean basically a great destruction of the aristocracy And now we see people being fired right and left from the upper ends of the federal bureaucracy, which is as close to aristocracy as we've got.
Mm.
And then I've also done a inauguration chart for the new administration, and it's going to be a wild ride. Interestingly, Trump is not as important as everyone wants to think he is. The sun is not that important in the inauguration chart. There are many other factors going on, and one of the things that he really needs to watch, and that his administration needs to watch, is they've been piled with a lot of, in some cases, wildly unrealistic hopes by their supporters.
Yeah.
And if they fail, they're going to have to manage the inevitable disappointment without setting off potentially explosive results. So it's going to be, the next 4 years are going to be quite a wild ride. That's one that I did as an open post on my Patreon and Subscribestar, because I did the same thing for the Biden's inaugural chart, and I'll do it whoever wins in next time around. In 2028, I'll do an open post for a public post for them also. But so that's as far as I've gotten so far. We're facing wrenching change. We're facing the elimination of a lot of bureaucratic positions, and a lot of our effectively our aristocracy is being cleared away. We are facing the new administration faces a great many challenges, although things are probably going to improve somewhat for ordinary working class Americans during the next 4 years.
Oh God, I hope.
So yeah, it would be nice. But that's there are limits to what can happen due to some of the placements. There's some risks of serious economic trouble. Toward the end of the 4-year period, there's a real risk of a speculative bubble taking off, and they haven't helped us then. But it does look as though things will improve somewhat for ordinary common or garden variety Americans during this 4-year period, if only because the Trump administration needs to cement its support. So
Right. Yeah, well, one of the things actually that I also want to talk about. I know that this book was primarily about mundane astrology, but I think the idea of mundane astrology creeps in when you're a newbie, when you're looking at natal charts and people start talking about the outer planets, right? Societal, and how important do you think the outer planets actually are in a natal chart? Now, I'm gonna show my ass a little bit here, show you my ignorance. When I'm doing a lot of that work, because I come from a magical background, I only use the 7 visible planets. Am I kind of like really missing anything, or would somebody just be better suited to tackle mundane?
Okay, I have found I have not studied that many natal charts. Obviously, I've studied my own rather intensely, and I studied my late wife's rather intensely, and I've done some others. In my experience, the outer planets do, and including Uranus and Neptune, do actually have quite a bit to teach. And for example, I have Uranus in the first house, and Uranus in the first house. That one of the things that indicates is that the road less traveled is your route of choice, and that's always been the case for me. And equally, Saturn and Jupiter have important things to say, but all the outer planets deal with how you relate to bigger patterns. They're how you relate to your culture, how you relate to the economy, how you relate to society, how you relate to life. Whereas the inner planets are telling you more how things work within yourself and within the narrow circle of like family and so on. So it is important to differentiate them, but I have found that Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, they really do play an important role in the natal charts that I've studied. Now, you will notice that I left out Pluto. Of course, I earned a certain amount of notoriety in the astrological community a few years ago by publishing a book arguing that while Pluto functioned as a planet between 1930 and 2006, it has lost that status. It is a dwarf planet. Its influence is fading away, and that there's still a lot of confusion, a lot of yelling about that, a lot of mischaracterization as well. I think a lot of people have heard of it but have not read my book. But Again, this is one of the things that I found from personal experience. If you watch the astrological chit chat online, when people make grand sweeping predictions based on the position of Pluto, they're wrong as reliably as anything. And generally speaking, I've found that predictions based on Pluto are wrong. I've come to think that in mundane terms, at least, Pluto is the planet of overblown hype and of misunderstanding and misapprehension. Anything that's anchored in Pluto, is overinflated hype. It's not actually going anywhere. But Pluto is also the planet of addiction, and there are a lot of people very addicted to Pluto. And so they get very angry when, but I mean, as a personal note, the reason I first started doubting that Pluto was really functioning in its role, this is quite a few years ago now, I had a Pluto in strong aspects to my natal moon and Venus, which should have had all, according to the books and the websites, should have had all these explosive results in my life. Nothing happened. Now, I've had Saturn returns that kicked my butt from here to Cleveland. Okay, I track my transits regularly, precisely because most of them will communicate. They'll communicate quite a bit to me, but Pluto doesn't. Pluto is a dud. Now, I have noticed in talking to people that those people for whom Pluto is strongly placed in their natal chart, they still seem to get some results from it. But the same is true of the other dwarf planet, Ceres, for example. My late wife had Ceres conjunct her natal Venus. Ceres is the dwarf planet of nutrition. And Sarah had very strong, tangled emotional relationships with food and with nourishment and with nurturing. Those were issues we had to work with very extensively early in our marriage, and there was something that always remained a thing for her. She's one of the few people I've ever known who would read cookbooks for pleasure. Not because she wanted to eat the food, but just because she knew that she could. She was starved by a psychotic mother in early childhood.
Wow.
And so when you have a dwarf planet conjunct or otherwise in strong relationship with one of your natal planets, apparently they still do have some effect. But if you don't, I mean, I've talked to other people who were, quaking in their boots because Pluto was doing a square with this or an opposition with that. And, a couple of years passed and they're going, nothing happened. None of that happened. What's going on here?
So one thing, obviously my podcast, we have a lot of people that come on and talk specifically about ceremonial, and I enjoyed the fact that you mentioned in the beginning that that's how your astrological interests really began, and same here.
That's where I started astrology. Yeah, how do you work out the proper chart to consecrate a talisman with maximum force?
Right. So do you think magicians need to be astrologers, or do you think they're utilizing it in a different way?
It depends on what kind of magic you want to practice. It really does. If you are focused on natural magic, it can be helpful, but it's not a big deal. If you're focused on Golden Dawn magic, again, it can be helpful, but it's not a big deal. If you're doing classic Renaissance magic, you cannot do that without a first-rate knowledge of astrology. If you're using the Picatrix or using any of the old Cornelius Agrippa's methods or so on, you live and die by your ability to calculate a correct chart, because that's the powerhouse that runs your magic. Mm-hmm. So I would certainly encourage any mage who has the least interest in astrology to study it, and to at least pick up a basic facility with electional astrology. And I would encourage any diviner who's interested to try horary astrology. If you get good at that, it is an extremely good, extremely clear and effective method of divination. Yeah. But I really don't think that you can. I really don't think you can say anything is an absolute must for everybody who's interested in magic. Magic is too broad a field for that. There are many different ways of doing things, and there ain't no such thing as one true way for everybody.
Yeah, as I develop in my practice over the course of the last, especially I would say the last 6 years, I really and moving more into what has been available been made available, especially, the thing that you and Chris Warnock, who's been on the show before as well, the
Oh yeah.
fantastic. I cited that. I cited some of your commentary in that in my last book. Again,
Hmm.
I recommend that as well. The Picatrix is huge for astrological magic, but I feel in a way that the more involved I get with astrology in a magical context, I feel more organically sort of enmeshed in the warp and woof of our cosmos. It's a really
Hmm.
interesting thing to move into astrology. Also, aside from the predictive, but in a magical context, do you
Hmm.
practice any
Hmm.
planetary remediation for, like, let's say, the things that you're seeing coming with your transits?
Um, I have well, I don't do a lot of magical remediation. There have been a few times when I have done so, and with various results, some success. I mean, because there are as it says, there are things you can change and there are things you can't. And a lot of times, especially when you're dealing with the malefics, a lot of times all you can do is brace yourself. And on the other hand, if you track your transits, you are in a position to use that knowledge constructively. You can see when there's a positive transit and take action at that time on that basis. Here is, even something as simple as the moon moving through, into a trine with Mercury. That gives you a couple of hours of window. Okay, that's when you contact the publisher.
Mm. Yeah, I mean,
Or
I don't know if
yeah,
people know this, but I elected for the first video on this channel, actually.
sweet. Sweet. Yeah. I basically I use transits as a kind of quick, simple election mode for many of my career activities. I'll say, if I'm contacting a new publisher, if I'm sending in a manuscript, I always choose a time when what's in the sky is positively interacting with things in my chart, and when there are no negative aspects going on affecting anything having to do with that aspect of my chart.
Mm.
So yeah, it works. That was the point when I started doing that was the point when I went from being moderately successful to being very comfortably successful as a professional writer and astrologer. So I would highly recommend that approach. As far as, full scale election for big things like starting a podcast, that makes perfect sense.
And there's that magical pragmatism again. It's really good
Yeah.
to use these things.
Yeah.
I have a sort of personal, maybe selfish question.
Mhm.
And it's kind of toggling here, but this is coming from my heart here.
Mhm.
In your decades of experience, right?
Mhm.
Between all the research and all the writing, how do you find ways? Because you are an extremely prolific writer with your fiction and everything. And I mean, there's a joke, that me and some of my author friends have, is just kind of like, should we write a book on this, or should we wait until John Michael Greer writes a book on it and then see how high the bar is and if it's worth attempting? Yeah, because you'll get there, and I mean that in the best possible way. But how do you balance the research, the writing, and the practice? That's because I
Oh,
am
okay.
struggling.
Okay. The first thing that my first rule here, because I get asked this quite a bit, the first thing that I do is that I have not owned a television in my adult life.
Wow.
Okay? That's the secret. Most people waste 4 to 6 hours a day sitting on the couch, watching the tube with drool puddling in their laps. Those 4 to 6 hours a day could give you a life. Okay?
Yeah.
So, I have never owned a television. And I also don't play video games or do any of those other time wasting things. And my social media is very limited. I post on my blog, I post on my Dream With Journal and I limit my correspondence because I have other things I want to do with life. And a regular schedule of magical practices, that's an important part of life. That's almost more important than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And it so happens that I am fortunate that I read very quickly. I learned to read at the age of 2.5, and so I've had a lot of practice. But I can sit down and read through some fairly hefty books in fairly short order. So that's kind of an unfair advantage that I have. But because on the one hand I'm a full-time writer, I don't have to schedule time for a day job because I don't have a television and I don't engage in these other unproductive, time-wasting activities. I have a lot of time where I can do things that I want to do. I have a lot of time where I can write, where I can study, where I can just read things that I want to read. That I can, if I need to spend, for a couple of weeks, 4 hours a day, doing some kind of intensive practice, I can do that. And it's a matter of where your priorities are. It's a matter of looking at the things you're doing in your life and saying, okay, does this actually contribute to my will? Does this fulfill what I desire in life? If it does not, chuck it. If that television is not actually contributing to your, to the fulfillment of your will, take it and drop it in a dumpster from as high as possible. If it's old enough to have a picture tube, the flash of the implosion is quite delectable. And if anything else, if it's not furthering your will, if it's not furthering what you want out of life, chuck it without mercy, and then go on and do something that actually feeds what you want to do. That's also a bit of Stoic advice, by the way. The Stoics were very into that. Again, look at your life. How much you and you alone can decide. What do you want to do with this limited amount of time you have on this planet? What do you not want to do? Where, the choices are yours. The value judgments are yours. You don't have to just drift. You can take action and become something.
Wise words. So as we get to the end of our conversation, regrettably so, I love talking to you. I love learning from you. But I'm sure I'll see you again soon.
I look forward to it.
I want to give you a chance to talk about anything else that you have forthcoming. Are you going to be with the release in this book? Are you doing anything with the blog? Ecosophia, etc. Anything else going on?
Well, the blog is chattering away. I have something up on the blog every Wednesday. We're winding up. Don't ask me how this happened, but we're winding up a series of posts on Richard Wagner's opera cycle, The Ring of the Nibelung.
Oh, wow.
And we're actually talking about the social and political, and because there's a lot of politics and a lot of economics in that. Wagner was a political radical in his time. But that's we'll be winding that up I think over the next month, and then going on to talking about the changed political environment, the economic consequences of the recent election, the ecological consequences of the recent election and its cascading effects nationwide, and so on. There's a lot of stuff to talk about. In other terms, let's see, I have. A little later this year, I have something coming out that may be of interest to listeners. I have retranslated John Dee's first significant book, Propedeutica Aphoristica, which was somewhat badly translated back in the 60s. I've redone it because the author did not know enough to realize that it's a guide to astrological magic.
Wow.
So it is translated with extensive commentary. It's being released by Azoth, the same publisher that did my translation of Giordano Bruno's On the Shadows of the Ideas. So it'll be available in a fine and an oh my god ultra fine edition, and then after a certain period, after those are sold off, it will be available in trade paper. That was a fun project. I'm doing a whole bunch of John Dee stuff right now. He was, talk about an astrologer. This is the guy, when as she was then, Princess Elizabeth, who would become Queen Elizabeth I, went to him and said, "Hi, I want you to elect a time for my coronation so that under my reign, England will be powerful and safe and glorious." I think he managed it.
Yeah.
And so, he was a heck of an astrologer. And so I think we can learn from him. So at any rate, I have a bunch of John Dee related projects I'm working on. So I'm neck deep in Elizabethan Latin right now, and I have various other things I'm working on another novel in the Ariel Moravec occult detective series, and so on.
Fantastic. So the last canned question everyone gets for the podcast is, with everything we've spoken about today or this evening, Could you recommend 3 books as perhaps supplementary materials to our conversation? Of course, go out and get uh, the Astrology of Nations that's been
Hmm.
published by Red Feather, and but what
Hmm.
else would you recommend as sort of supplementary materials?
Supplementary material. I am going to put in a plug for my book, The Twilight of Pluto, because that discusses some of the issues around Pluto, around the mundane astrology of the discovery and why would you the decline of a planet, the removal of it from planetary status. I think that's fairly useful. Another thing for anybody who's interested in astrological magic, Secrets of Planetary Magic by Chris Warnock is worth its weight in gold. That's a good place to start. And if you have no idea about any of this astrology stuff, if you know all the if you barely know what the zodiac is, Julia and Derek Parker's Astrology is it's a kind of a coffee table book. It's heavily illustrated, but I found it to be the best introduction for the complete newbie. And so that I would recommend that one.
Great. Thank you so much, JMG, John Michael Greer. Always a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to everything you've got coming up, and I hope to see you soon.
I look forward to it.